There is a piece of turtle shell in a museum case in Washington. It is smaller than your palm. Flip it over, and the back is covered with small hollows, drilled in neat rows, each one scorched black at the bottom. Turn it face up again, and directly above every hollow there is a crack. And next to the cracks, someone carved words. Two of the inscriptions ask whether it will rain. The third reports that a hunting party came home with 20 deer. The Chinese word for this kind of fortune-telling is written with a character of two strokes. A vertical line with a short branch off one side. It is a picture of a crack. The word is a short, blunt syllable, something close to boo. And scholars believe it was chosen because that is the noise a bone makes when it splits in the heat. The people who made this shell named the act of asking after the sound of the answer. One detail about that shell takes a moment to sink in. The crack was the answer, and the crack came first. The shell was heated. It split. The king looked at the split and announced what it meant. And only then did someone sit down with a knife and carve the question into the surface beside it. He was writing down a question that everyone in the room already knew the answer to. This video is about why, who the question was addressed to, how a dead turtle was made to answer it, and why. Once the answer was in hand, somebody still took the trouble to carve the question in a script that can be read 3,000 years later. Nearly every inscribed bone that has ever been found comes from one place. A bend in the Huan River in northern Henan, outside the modern city of Anyang, where the last kings of the Shang Dynasty kept their capital from about 1250 to 1050 BC. And nearly every one of them was made for one household. Of the tens of thousands of bones dug up there, the great majority record the questions of the royal family. And the largest share, by far, belongs to a single king, Wu Ding, who ruled somewhere around 1200 BC. Wu Ding had a bad tooth. We know this because he asked about it more than once. And the questions are still on the bone. One of them reads, "There is a sick tooth. Is it Father Yi who is harming it?" Father Yi was Wu Ding's own father, the previous king, dead and buried across the river. On other bones, the king runs through his dead uncles one at a time. And on one, he has an animal offered up to a dead relative he suspects, with a note saying he thinks this is the one causing the illness. So the ruler of the most powerful state in East Asia sat with a toothache and worked his way through his family tree, trying to figure out which dead relative was doing it to him. That one bone tells you nearly everything about who was being asked. For the Shang, a dead king did not go away. He moved up. He kept his rank. He kept his name. And he took a place in a hierarchy of the dead that ran much like the court he had left behind. From there, he could send rain or hold it back, bless a harvest or ruin it, help an army or turn his back on it. And when he was displeased, he could reach down and put an ache in a living man's jaw. David Cately, who spent his career on these bones, noticed how the requests were sorted. The recently dead handled small matters. The long dead handled big ones. Above all of them sat a high god called Dai, distant, rarely asked anything directly, and hard to read. A dead father was easier. You knew his name. You had known him. That is also why the questions went up through the king. The ancestors were his relatives. A farmer could no more ask Father Yi for rain than a stranger can walk into someone else's family reunion and start making requests. The king was the living head of that family. So the king asked, and the answers came to him. Asking the dead for help was, in the end, a kind of official correspondence. And official correspondence has one habit that will matter later in this video. It leaves a record. What the king asked about was rarely mystical. Would it rain in the next 10 days? Would the eastern lands bring in a harvest? Should the army march against the Tufang? Did last night's dream mean anything? Would the queen's delivery go well? Fortune telling, to a modern ear, sounds like asking whether you will get rich. For a kingdom that lived on millet and needed the rains to arrive on schedule, whether it would rain in the next 10 days was a question about who would still be alive next year. The question had been put to the dead. Now the bone had to be made to answer it. The Shang did not invent this. Scorched shoulder blades turn up at village sites across northern China from well over 1,000 years before Anyang, back into the Stone Age. People had been heating bone and reading the cracks for a very long time, and then throwing the bone away. Across all those centuries, none of those bones carries a single character. The asking was old. What was new at Anyang was everything that came after the crack. And to see why, you have to watch a bone go through the whole process. Two materials did the work. The first was the shoulder blade of an ox, a wide, flat bone with a thick ridge up one side, taken from cattle that had already been slaughtered for sacrifice. The second was the bottom shell of a turtle, the plastron, which is flatter than any bone in a cow's body and splits more cleanly. Turtles were the problem. The species the Shang preferred did not live in the cold north in any numbers, so shells came in as tribute from the south. And some of them still carry a short note on the bridge of the shell recording, who delivered them and how many. Kately once made a rough estimate of the scale of the whole operation. Working back from what has been found and what the pits at Anyang were likely to hold, he put the total at somewhere between 2 and 4 million pieces over the life of the capital, which would mean the shells and shoulder blades of well over 100,000 animals. This was a state industry for asking questions. A fresh shoulder blade is a poor surface for anything. It is greasy. It has that ridge running up one edge. And it curves. So, the bones went to a workshop first. The flesh was scraped off. The ridge was sawn away, and the socket was cut down flat. Then both faces were ground smooth and polished until the bone took on a dull shine, close to the finish on a piece of ivory. Turtle shells got the same treatment. And a plastron was sometimes sawn apart along the middle, and the two halves worked separately. Preparing a single piece took days. By the time a bone reached the diviner, it was already a finished product. And somewhere in the city, there were people whose whole job was making them. Then came the step that hardly anyone mentions. And it is the one that decides everything. On the back of the polished bone, a craftsman cut a row of hollows. Each one was made in 2 parts. A long oval, gouged deep enough that only a thin skin of bone was left at the bottom. And right beside it, a small, round pit, drilled even closer to the front surface. He repeated the pair in a straight line. Then started another line beside it, until the back of the bone looked like a field of neat, paired scoops. Turn the bone over and the front is still smooth. But the bone is now thinnest at exactly those points. And when heat hits the back of a hollow, the front has nowhere to give except there. A crack will open above the round pit, and it will run along the line of the oval, a vertical line with a branch off one side, the shape of the character for divination, the shape from the beginning of this video, which means the answer from the ancestors was going to arrive where a man with a drill had decided it would arrive, and in roughly the shape he had prepared for it. How the branch turned, how far it ran, that was still up to the bone. But the place and the outline were settled before the fire was lit. Remember the drill. It is one of the reasons the question got written down at all. The ritual itself has to be pieced together from the bones, because nobody described it in writing at the time. It went something like this. The date was fixed by a cycle of 60 named days that the Shang used to count time. A diviner presided, and diviners had names. K, Bin, Zhang, Y, and around 120 others have been identified across the reigns of the last Shang kings, which is how scholars can put the bones in order. The question was put in two halves, one positive and one negative. It will rain, it will not rain. We will receive a harvest this year. We will not receive a harvest this year. The two halves were often set on opposite sides of the shell, mirror images of each other. Then a rod, probably bronze, was heated until it glowed and pressed into a hollow on the back. There was a pause while the bone took the heat. Then a sound, short and dry, like a knuckle cracking. And on the front, a split in the surface. Sometimes one crack was enough. Often it was not, and the diviner moved to the next hollow and did it again. 5 times. 10 times. For the same question. And each crack got a number scratched beside it, so the sequence could be followed later. Then the king looked at the cracks, whether the side branch went up or down, how long it ran, at what angle it left the main line, whether it was clean or forked. No one today knows the rules he used. There was a system, because the same crack shapes come with the same verdicts across many bones. But it was never written out, and the people who knew it are gone. What survives is the result, recorded in one fixed phrase that appears on thousands of bones. The king read the cracks and said, "Auspicious." At that point, the ceremony was over. The ancestors had spoken. The king had translated. And everyone present had heard it. And now, usually, a different man stepped up to the bone. He was the engraver, and he worked with a small blade of bronze or hard stone, cutting characters a few millimeters tall into the polished surface beside the cracks. He kept the writing off the cracks themselves, because the cracks were the answer. A blade in bone favors short, straight strokes over long, curved ones. And that is a large part of why this script has the angular, spiky look it does. On some pieces, the finished characters were rubbed with pigment. Red from iron ore, black from soot. So they stood out against the bone. On a few, the words were written first with a brush and ink and never got carved, which tells you the engraver sometimes worked from a draft, and on some, the characters are clumsy. The same short phrase cut over and over. Uneven, with a cleaner version beside it in a steadier hand. Practice bones. Somebody was teaching apprentices to do this. That engraver had other ways to write. Among the characters on these bones is the Shang word for a book, and it is a drawing of thin slats bound together with cord. Books of bamboo or wood were already familiar objects in this city. That will matter. So the cracks held the answer. The king had already read it out loud. What was the engraver doing? Start with what a complete inscription looks like, because most of them are incomplete. And the few that are whole explain a great deal. A full record on a Shang bone has 4 parts. The first gives the date and the name of the man presiding. The second gives the charge, the matter that was put to the ancestors. The third gives the king's reading of the cracks. And the fourth, the rare one, gives what actually happened afterward. One well-known bone carries all 4, and it reads like this. On one of the 60 named days, the king made cracks and divined. We will hunt at Wu. And going out, and coming back, there will be no disaster. The king read the cracks and said, auspicious. Then the fourth part, cut later. Once the hunting party was home, we caught one wild buffalo, one tire, 7 foxes. That fourth line is neither a question nor a forecast. It is a report. Somebody waited for the hunt to end, counted the animals, came back to the same bone and added the result beside the crack that had predicted it. The engraver was building something that could be checked. That is the first reason the question was carved. The bone is the only surface where the question, the answer from the dead, and the outcome in the world all sit together, a few millimeters apart. Take one more. The diviner Ke put the charge. Lady Hao will give birth, and it will be good. Lady Hao was Fu Hao, the king's consort, a woman who led armies in her own right and appears on more than 300 bones. The king read the cracks and said, "If she gives birth on a ding day, it will be good. If on a gang day, greatly auspicious." Then the last line. After 31 days, on the day Jiayan, she gave birth. It was not good. It was a girl. The Shang wanted sons, and the record does not pretend otherwise. What matters here is that they carved it anyway. The prediction had promised good. The result was not good. And the king's own scribe cut the disappointment into the bone and left it there, beside the forecast for anyone to compare. The second reason is what happened to the bones afterward. Picture a man in a storeroom at Anyang, stacking used turtle shells into a round pit, edge to edge, layer on layer. The same question had been put again and again. 10 days of no disaster. 10 days of no disaster. Week after week for the length of a reign. And the used bones were kept rather than thrown away. Some plastrons carry a number on the edge, marking their place in a batch. And when that pit was opened, on the 12th of June, 1936, it held more than 17,000 inscribed pieces, packed into a shaft 2 meters across. Nearly everyone from the reign of Wu Ding, whoever filled it, was putting records away in order. The way a clerk files documents. And the reason a clerk files documents is that someone might need to look one up. This is the record that official correspondence leaves. The Shang kept theirs on bone. The third reason repeats on the bone thousands of times. The king read the cracks and said, "Diviners were named, but the moment when a crack became a verdict belonged to one man, and the inscription says so every time. Remember the drill. The crack fell where a craftsman had thinned the bone. The verdict came from the king, and the writing fixed both in place for anyone who picked up the bone later. Look at Lady Hao once more. Ding good, gang better. She gave birth on a Jia day, which was neither, and the outcome was bad. Read carefully. The king's forecast was never wrong. The record shows a king who reads cracks very well, and it was written by men who worked for him. There is one more piece of the answer, and it is the plain one. The Shang wrote on other things. They had brushes, and a few of the bones still carry brushwork that was never carved. They had books of bound slats, because their character for a book is a drawing of one. The king's orders, their letters, their lists of tribute, almost certainly went on to bamboo and wood. Materials like that rot in the ground unless the conditions are unusually kind. Bone and shell last far more reliably. So the honest version is this. Questions were carved on bone because the ritual happened on bone, and the bone was the place to file the outcome. And questions are what survived because bone is what survived. One caution. Some scholars, David Cately among them, have argued that many of these charges were never questions at all. The Shang script has no question mark, and a line like it will. Rain can be read as a proposal the ancestors were asked to approve rather than something they were asked to predict. That argument has run for decades and is not settled. Either way, the fourth line is still there. Whether they asked or proposed, they wrote down what happened next. The bones went into the pits. They stayed in the ground for roughly 2,900 years. And when people finally started digging them up, they ground them into medicine. For as long as anyone in the village of Shaotun could remember, the fields turned up bones. Farmers plowed them out of the yellow earth outside Anyang, and there was a market for them. Chinese pharmacies bought old bone by the pound under the name dragon bone and ground it into powder for wounds, fevers, and malaria. Pieces with marks on them sold worse, so dealers often scraped the marks off before weighing them. Nobody can say how many inscriptions were swallowed as medicine before anyone thought to read one. A famous story says that in 1899, a scholar in Beijing named Wang Yirong was sick with malaria, and when his prescription arrived from the pharmacy, he noticed characters on the bone in it. Historians have never been able to confirm the malaria or the prescription. What is solid is that Wang, an expert in ancient bronze inscriptions, saw pieces of inscribed bone that year, recognized the writing as older than anything he knew, and started buying every piece the dealers would bring him. More than 1,000 in all. He was dead within a year. In the summer, when foreign armies marched into Beijing, he never published a word about the bones. His collection passed to a friend, who printed the first rubbings in 1903, and it took several more years for anyone to force out of the dealers where the bones were actually coming from. Then, in 1917, a scholar named Wang Guowei did something with them that changed what China knew about its own past. The oldest full history of China was written by Sima Qian around 100 BC, and it includes a list of the kings of the Shang, name by name, in order. Sima Qian was writing roughly 1,000 years after the last Shang king died. And for a long time, many scholars treated that list with the same caution people bring to the kings of Troy. Wang Guowei went through the bones and pulled out the names of the ancestors being offered sacrifice. Father Yi, grandfather Ding, ancestor Jia. This was only possible because a Shang engraver had cut a date and a name beside every question. Exactly the filing habit from earlier in this video. Wang worked out the order in which the ancestors were honored and built a family tree from it. Then he set it beside Sima Qian's list. They matched, king after king, with only a handful of small disagreements about sequence. A dynasty that many had filed under legend now had witnesses from its own time. And the witnesses were questions about rain and toothaches. The filing had worked. It had just taken 3,000 years for someone to look one up. Scientific excavation at Anyang began in 1928. And on the 12th of June, 1936, the diggers hit the pit from the previous chapter. There were so many shells packed into it, so tightly, that the team gave up trying to lift them one at a time. They cut the entire pit out of the ground as a single block of earth, boxed it, and hauled it to the railway. It went to Nanjing. The next year, the war with Japan began. And the block went with the retreating institute to Kunming in the far southwest, then back to Nanjing. And in 1949, across the water to Taiwan, where it still is. Inside were 17,096 inscribed pieces, along with a few shells where the words had been brushed on in ink and never carved. The oldest handwriting in China, in all. Around 150,000 inscribed pieces have been recovered. They contain roughly 4,500 distinct characters, and only about a third of them have been read with confidence. The ones that have been read are recognizable. Because the script the Shang engraver cut into bone is the direct ancestor of the characters used in China today. Go back to the shell in the case in Washington. 2 questions about rain. 1 report of 20 deer. Somewhere behind it are a craftsman who drilled the hollows, a man who held the hot rod, and an engraver who sat down afterward and cut the words. None of them are named. The diviner is named, and the king is named. And that was the point. The Shang carved these questions because they wanted to know what would happen next. They could not have known that, 3,000 years later, their questions would be the answers.